Hello and welcome to the Gaggle What We Challenge, and if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely, and I just want to do a short podcast on the events of Tuesday in Riyadh, where, as you know, the Russian foreign minister met the U.S. Negotiating team, comprising, of course, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, and then Trump's negotiator extraordinaire Steve Witkoff. Um, as you know, many commentators have pointed out, there's obviously a major rift that has emerged between the European component of NATO and the United States. And of course, there's a major rift between the United States and Ukraine. Trump promised during the campaign and even before the campaign, throughout these years, that he would bring this war to an end. And his claim that he would be able to do so was based on his own personal rapport, or claims of a personal rapport with Russian President Putin and with President Zelensky. He says, well, I get on well with both of them, and it's just going to take me 24 hours. I'm going to be able to sort all of this out. So now he's been president for now almost a month. And of course, he was elected. He won the election now 3 months ago. So he obviously hasn't brought it to an end, but nonetheless, he has done what he said he would do, which would that he would use his personal relations, particularly with the Russian leader, to try to bring this war to an end. And immediately we can see that Trump's approach is very different from that of the Biden administration, obviously very different from that of the Europeans. He sees this war as an unnecessary, disastrous war that needs to end and needs to end now. He thinks it's a stupid war, should never have happened, would never have happened, as he likes to say, were he president. And so he will just go in and try to sort this out. Now, he had a phone conversation with President Putin last week. Again, this is the first time there's been any kind of personal dialogue between the President of the United States and the Russian president since really just before the start of the so-called SMO. So it's been a long time. And following that conversation, basically, there was an agreement that the two negotiating teams would meet in Saudi Arabia. Now, what emerged from this meeting was clearly, and this is obviously a reflection of the approach of President Trump, and Trump is obviously directing this policy, which is that the United States is offering Russia a dramatic improvement of relations, normalization of relations, even a partnership on geopolitical issues, and down the road, economic partnership, mutually beneficial commercial ties. And in return, of course, the United States expects something. And that something is, of course, that Russia brings this war to an end. It's to agree to a ceasefire, an armistice, or whatever, and then begin the process of negotiations. So this approach is, has infuriated the Europeans, infuriated much of the media, and infuriated much of the foreign policy elites and the think tank world and everyone else, whose goal is, well, we're just going to keep this war going until such time either Ukraine wins or Ukraine gets itself into a very strong negotiating position and Russia would have to capitulate. But that's the program. Trump's view, this war needs to end. needs to end right now. So here, the United States is taking the responsible, mature position, but for Russia, it obviously is problematic because Russia has, at this stage, not yet accomplished its goals. The four oblasts, which are namely Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye, are not under full Russian control, with the exception of Lugansk. But Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye are not under full Russian control, even though Russia claims them now to be part of the Russian Federation. So that's one thing. There's also the issue of some long-term security architecture along the lines of a kind of Helsinki 2.0, whereby Russia's security concerns are addressed, and there's no further plans for NATO expansion to Russia's borders, no plans to deploy missiles, NATO infrastructure right up to Russia's borders. So Russia wants something along those lines, because otherwise the war starts up again in 5-10 years' time. But that is obviously a stretch, given the rabid hostility of the European members of NATO. So Russia has now obtained one very important goal, which is suddenly the United States is going out of its way to court Russia, to say, let's work together, let's bring this unfortunate era to an end, let's bring this war to an end. Makes no sense, and then the idea being, of course, is that the Europeans would follow suit. But this then for Russia is, a very difficult decision to take, because, of course, if Russia responds in a positive way to these American overtures, then clearly people inside Russia will feel, well, yeah, but we haven't accomplished our goals, and what's to prevent this whole thing starting up again in 5 years' time? Once Trump is gone, there'll be somebody else there, and then we're back to where we started. And once again, then Russia will feel that we trusted the West, and look where it got us. We didn't get anywhere. We ended the war. We were winning the war. We ended it, and once again, the West has played us for suckers. So there is that. On the other hand, if Russia then says, no, we're just going to go ahead and pursue this war until a successful conclusion, then that risks antagonizing Trump, and that will bring the split between America and Europe to an end. And then the Americans and the Europeans will coalesce once again and determine on this policy of escalating the fighting against Russia in Ukraine. So that's I don't think that's a desirable situation for Russia. So it's a very difficult and challenging situation for Russia. But anyway, what happened in the meetings, and it's kind of interesting, if we look at the American readout from the meeting in Riyadh. So we have here the meeting with Secretary Rubio's meeting with Russian Minister Lavrov, and this is what the Americans said in their readout, that they agreed to establish a consultation mechanism to address irritants to our bilateral relationship, with the objective of taking steps necessary to normalize the operation of our respective diplomatic missions. So, the year after year, there have been these mutual tit-for-tat expulsions, closure of consulates. So this has prevented any normal diplomatic work being conducted in either country. So that's one thing. Again, that's part of the normalization process that Trump is offering to the Russians. And then second, appoint respective high-level teams to begin working on a path to ending the conflict in Ukraine as soon as possible in a way that is enduring, sustainable, and acceptable to all sides. So this is an important one because here, essentially, they're going to put together teams to negotiate some kind of an outcome, well, meaning that obviously the terms of the cessation of hostilities, ceasefire, and whatever else that comes afterwards. So, I mean, the Russians would want some kind of a new security architecture along the lines of those draft treaties that they presented the Americans and NATO in December 2021. So that would be one thing. Then they would also want constitutional changes in Ukraine, maybe making Russian an official language, a prohibition on the worshipping of the Nazi collaborators in Ukraine. So these will all be part of in negotiations. But interestingly, again, it's between the United States and Russia. Ukraine isn't involved in that. So whatever demands that the Russians are going to present, or even whatever demands that the Americans are going to present to the Russians, the Ukrainians will not be involved in that. This will be entirely discussion between the Americans and the Russians. And then he says, would lay the groundwork for future cooperation on matters of mutual geopolitical interest and historic economic and investment opportunities which will emerge from a successful end to the conflict in Ukraine. So again, this is part of the issues of geopolitical interest. In other words, their partnership, which, again, we don't exactly know what the United States has in mind for mutual geopolitical interest. The Russians would obviously cooperate in any kind of a war against terrorism, a war against child trafficking, for instance, drug trafficking. I don't think the Russians will go for any kind of cooperation on tightening the noose on Iran, let alone waging some kind of war against Iran. Russians wouldn't cooperate on that, and they wouldn't cooperate on any kind of tightening the noose on China either. So that's left in the air what this mutual geopolitical interest is. And then investment opportunities which will emerge from a successful end to the conflict in Ukraine. The parties to today's meetings pledge to remain engaged to make sure the process moves forward in a timely and productive manner. So that's the American readout. And then here is the Russian readout, or at least this is the speech delivered by Lavrov following the meeting in Riyadh, and then some answers to media questions. And then Lavrov says, well, the conversation was useful. We not only listened, but also heard each other. I have reason to believe that the American side has begun to better understand our position, which we have once again outlined in detail, and so on. As for the agreements reached, the first and probably the most urgent, and certainly not the most difficult, is to ensure the earliest possible appointments of Russian ambassadors to the United States and the United States to Russia, and also to remove the obstacles that for many years, primarily by the administration of Biden, have been built on the direction of our diplomatic missions, seriously complicating their work, the endless expulsion of our diplomats, and so on. So again, much similar, only slightly more verbose than what the American readout had it. And then second agreement, we agreed that in the near future, a process for Ukrainian settlement will be formed. The American side will announce who will represent Washington in this work. As soon as we learn the name and position of the corresponding representative, then, as Russian President Putin told Donald Trump, we will immediately designate our participant in the process. So the order is that the Americans will name who will comprise their negotiating team, and then on the basis of their seniority or expertise, the Russians will name their corresponding negotiating partners. And then thirdly, in a broad conceptual sense, as processes related to the settlement of the crisis in Ukraine progress, we must simultaneously create conditions for our cooperation to resume in full and expand into a wide range of areas. So the Americans talked about geopolitical issues of concern. He just simply says into a wide range of areas, nothing specific. There has been great interest in resuming consultations on geopolitical issues, including various conflicts in different parts of the world where both the US and Russia have interests. Well, that's interesting. Where do these interests coincide? Because in the Middle East, they certainly do not coincide. I mean, Russia is, while not exactly thrusting itself forward as an advocate of the Palestinian cause, nonetheless, it adheres to the official so-called international consensus that there needs to be a two-state solution, and the Americans are no longer advocating for that. But anything else, against Iran or China, there doesn't seem to be any real consensus from the US and Russia. And even when we get to Africa, there's clearly very little consensus between the Americans and the Russians. So great interest was expressed in removing artificial barriers to the development of mutually beneficial economic cooperation. And the head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund, Dmitriev, was present at the discussion of economic aspects of our meeting today. He presented some problems that could be resolved fairly quickly to the benefit of both Russia and the United States. So this is, again, they're talking very much along these lines of, hey, there's opportunities to make money for the Americans. And I think Dmitriev, in his comments in Riyadh, though he wasn't at the negotiating table, which was itself interesting, but he was present talking to reporters during the breaks in the meetings. He was talking to reporters and talking about how the Americans have essentially forfeited huge sums of money through the sanctions policy. So clearly, very much like Zelensky, they're trying to appeal to Trump's business interests. Hey, there's a lot of money to be had in Russia. Anyway, so here's a question to Lavrov. There are different assessments now, mostly positive. They are already coming from the American side. On which track have you managed to bring the most positions closer together with the US? On the Russian-American or Ukrainian track, have you managed to lay the foundations for a meeting between the presidents of Russia and the US? What are the next steps? Will you have meetings in the near future? And US Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that concessions will be required from everyone on the Ukrainian track. Is there any understanding? So, pretty much the questions everybody wants to know the answers to. And then says, well, regarding the issues on which we managed to reach mutual understanding, this does not necessarily mean a rapprochement of positions. I've already spoken about this. We have practically agreed that we need to resolve once and for all the problems of the functioning of our diplomatic missions, a mutual desire to find specific solutions to issues of our dialogue on international affairs and economic ties has been outlined. So he doesn't really answer the question. Again, much like the Americans, the Russians stick to this issue of, well, we're going to normalize the work of the respective diplomatic missions. And then as for the Ukrainian topic, I mentioned the agreement that the Americans will appoint their representative. We will reciprocate. After that, the relevant consultations will begin. They will be regular. We met by decisions of the presidents of Russia and the United States, who agreed to conduct business on preparation of the next summit. One should say, incidentally, that Trump spoke later in the day, and which we'll come to that. But one of the things that he said later in the day is that there will be a meeting. He expects a meeting with Putin sometime before the end of the month, which really doesn't give a lot of time, because we're essentially it's going to less than 10 days. You know, it's going to take a lot more planning than that for a meeting. But nonetheless, Trump saying that there's going to be a meeting, even though neither from Rubio nor Lavrov is there any indication that anything has been agreed to about a summit. For this purpose, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, National Security Advisors were instructed to meet and see what needs to be worked out before the presidents can begin to agree on a specific date and time frame for holding the summit. And then the question, immediately after the meeting, a lot of information appeared citing some sources close to the diplomatic process regarding a three-stage plan that Russia allegedly agreed upon with the US regarding Ukraine, which is that would be quite startling that the Russians had agreed to some kind of a three-stage plan. Is this true? And then Lavrov says, regarding the three-point plan, I have not seen this information or reports. Today, when I was skimming the news, I found a link to a statement by Polish Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski, who said somewhere in the corridors of Munich that he had met with US Representative Kellogg. He informed him of some kind of a settlement plan. It did not say 3 points or 4, but Sikorski, commenting on the plan, said that he could not reveal the details. The plan is atypical, but it could be very interesting. Today I asked Secretary of State Rubio and Waltz what this means. They said it is fake. So the originator of the story about the three-stage plan was apparently Radek Sikorski, and they said it's fake. And of course, we have learned not to believe anything Radek Sikorski says. So if it came from Sikorski, you know, almost by definition, it's fake. Question, before this meeting, the US sent a questionnaire to the European Union asking what Europe could offer in terms of providing security guarantees to Ukraine. There's a question about introducing a contingent into Ukrainian territory. How does Moscow feel about this? As we discussed on Monday, we talked about UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer's article in the Daily Telegraph, in which he advocated introducing US forces into Ukraine, and said he was going to do it. He was ready to put UK forces into harm's way. But it was very strange because he used the terms peacekeepers and security guarantors for Ukraine interchangeably. And that, which is very, very strange, because if you're a peacekeeper, then you're essentially there to keep the peace. You're not supposed to be a participant on one side or another. You're a disinterested observer to making sure that each warring side adheres to the agreement. A security guarantor is something very different. A security guarantor is really in the business of preparing for the next round of fighting, or just simply a provocateur trying to provoke the next round of fighting. Um, and that's why Starmer's use of the term, I'm putting UK forces into harm's way, was so strange, because if you're a peacekeeper, why would you be putting your forces into harm's way? But anyway, this was the question. And then Lavrov says, regarding the floating information that the Americans asked the European Union a number of questions in order to better understand what the EU is going to do and how the Americans can be useful or involved, I have already mentioned this. But he also said the topic of potential deployment of some armed peacekeeping forces, allegedly after the conflict, has already been resolved or an agreement has been reached, as mentioned in this paper, interests the Americans from the point of view of which countries are ready to provide them. It is clear that the question is addressed to members of the European Union. And then he goes on, we explain to our interlocutors that we noted well that Donald Trump, in several of his speeches, was the first among Western leaders to clearly say that drawing Ukraine into NATO is one of the main reasons for what is happening, that this is one of the biggest mistakes of the Biden administration, and that if Trump were president, he would not have allowed this, which is true. Trump has said this, that the primary cause of this war has been the insistence of pushing Ukraine into NATO. And again, nothing so startling about that. Jens Stoltenberg has blurted this out as well. In this regard, we explained to our colleagues that President Putin has repeatedly emphasized that NATO expansion, the absorption of Ukraine by NATO, is a direct threat to the interests of the Russian Federation and our sovereignty. Therefore, the appearance of armed forces from the same NATO countries, but under a foreign flag, under the flag of the European Union, or under national flags, does not change anything in this regard. This is unacceptable for us. And this is exactly what one would have expected. There's no way the Russians are going to accept peacekeepers who are not really peacekeepers because they're representing the NATO countries, whether they're under a NATO flag or not. They're representing NATO countries. NATO is a party to this conflict, and therefore they're not really peacekeepers. They are there to provoke a conflict, and they are therefore directly a threat to Russia, because of course the moment they're there, they're going to expand their presence, and they'll be ginning up Ukraine for the next round of fighting. So of course Russia will say this is unacceptable for us. Anyway, Trump then later in the day said something quite extraordinary, because Zelensky had been enraged by these meetings in Riyadh and declared that he's not going to accept anything that is agreed upon by the United States and Russia. And this really annoyed Trump no small amount, for understandable reasons. After all, Ukraine is a complete dependency of the United States. The United States has poured in huge amounts of money, American taxpayer money, huge amounts of money into Ukraine, and he doesn't expect a complete dependent to speak like that about his patron. So he made clear that, as we'll see, he made clear that, well, Ukraine has had plenty of opportunities, 3 years of opportunities to bring this war to an end. Ukraine hasn't done so. And so therefore it's a little much for Ukraine to complain about what the Americans are doing when Ukraine didn't do anything to bring this war to an end. And of course, Trump seems to be, though he doesn't say it explicitly, seems to be referring to the Istanbul Agreement, which goes back to April 2022, almost 3 years ago, which could indeed have brought this war to an end. Ukraine seemed Zelensky's Ukraine seemed ready to agree to that deal, but at the behest of the sort of NATO warmongers, Boris Johnson among them. But of course, he was working in tandem with the Biden administration. That never came about. But Trump clearly says something that is absolutely true. The war could have ended. I mean, of course, the war could easily have been avoided, should easily have been avoided, but it could absolutely have ended in April 2022. But this, of course, has enraged the media. And here is a typical headline from the Washington Post: parroting Kremlin. That's nice. Parroting Kremlin. Anytime anyone says anything that the mainstream media don't like, then it's Putin talking points. You just, this is Putin's poisonous propaganda. You're repeating the Kremlin line. Parroting Kremlin, Trump blames Zelensky for war, angering Ukrainians. And then President Donald Trump said Vladimir Zelensky had low approval ratings and elections were needed. Statements also made in the past week by the Kremlin and disputed by Ukrainians. So if you say anything that the Kremlin also says, then it must, by definition, be false. And so he says, Ukrainians from across the political spectrum rallied behind President Zelensky. From across the political spectrum, there is no political spectrum in Ukraine. There's no political freedom in Ukraine, so there's no political spectrum. Rallied behind President Zelensky, decrying President Trump's claims that he was failing, unpopular, illegitimate, and to blame for the 2020 invasion of the country that has killed and wounded hundreds of thousands of people and displaced millions. So, that's counts as reporting in the Washington Post. And then, then they quote Trump, says, "Today I heard, oh, we weren't invited," Trump said, referring to Ukraine's complaints about being excluded from the meetings and fears that Washington and Moscow will reach a settlement to impose on Ukraine. Then, well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it. Trump said, you should have never started it. You could have made a deal. But of course, all of that is absolutely correct. I mean, every country has to act responsibly and has to act in accordance with geography, in accordance with history, and not pick ridiculous and hopeless wars. But this, of course, is what Ukraine since 2014 has done, and maybe even before, back in the day of the Orange Revolution in 2004. So he's right. You should never have started. It could easily have been avoided. The Minsk Accords could and easily should have been implemented. The Minsk Accords were never favorable to Russia. They were always very favorable to Ukraine. Russia could have incorporated the Donetsk and Lugansk into the Russian Federation following the referendums in 2014. Russia didn't do that. All what Russia wanted was implementation of the Minsk Accords, namely the creation of kind of an autonomous entities in Donetsk and Lugansk, and a constitutional change recognizing the special status of Donetsk and Lugansk. That never happened. So yeah, you should never have started it. You could have made a deal. All perfectly correct. But again, you're not supposed to say that in any context in which the public hears things like this. As he's the president. He says it. I mean, you can have the gaggle saying it or any other alt media saying it, but in a forum in which the president says it, that gets audience, and that should never happen. And that's why the media are melting down over the statement by Trump. He also suggested that Ukraine must hold elections and falsely stated that Zelensky's approval ratings sit at just 4%, falsely stated. The survey published on Wednesday by the Kiev International Institute of Sociology, a prominent Ukrainian polling organization, said some 57% of Ukrainians trust Zelensky, an increase of 5 points from a survey in December. Now, the Kiev International Institute of Sociology is it's not in any kind of a respected polling organization. It works with the EU. It works with the World Bank. It works with the United States. So it's not in any way objective. Whatever the polls are, and probably it's higher than 4%. Nonetheless, I mean, Trump is prone to rhetorical flourishes. I certainly do not believe for 1 minute that that he has 57% of Ukrainians supporting him, an increase of 5 points from December. Well, because he's done such a great job since December. Anyway, it says that Trump's comments, which directly echo Russian rhetoric on the war. So this goes back to the happy days of Russiagate. Whenever Trump said anything, it echoes the Kremlin line. Echo Russian rhetoric on the war, unleashed a firestorm of support for Zelensky. A firestorm of support for Zelensky. Where is this firestorm? Where the call for elections in particular was seen as a means to sow chaos and divide the country. Who sees it as a means to sow chaos and divide the country? Well, the people around Zelensky, and of course all the reporters who hang around with Zelensky, and always interviewing him or interviewing his flunkies and whatever. Here are a collection of stories from the front page of the New York Times. Here's a gathering of headlines. Zelensky urges more truth after Trump suggests Ukraine started the war. One story. Below, European leaders meet in Paris to recalibrate after Trump sides with Russia. Trump is now siding with Russia. And then below that, Trump's pivot toward Putin's Russia upends generations of U.S. policy. This is the whole idea of the generations of U.S. policy. How can you have generations when Putin has only been there one generation? So I think they mean that all those great, glorious presidents in the past, during the Cold War, they have all been upended because Trump wants to work out some kind of a deal with Russia. Of course, this is untrue because there have been innumerable presidents who were ready to work out agreements with the Soviet Union, going back to Eisenhower, to Nixon, Kennedy, Reagan. I mean, there've been innumerable, but they would like to create this idea that somehow there was this wonderful consensus about dealing with the Russians, and Trump is breaking this glorious consensus. Anyway, here's the Guardian. Trump blames Ukraine over war with Russia, saying it could have made a deal. Well, it's obviously true. I mean, you can't express all this outrage when you're saying something that's true. There was that deal. We're talking, of course, there was Minsk, but then there was the Istanbul deal. President hits back at Ukraine's complaint that it has been left out of the US-Russia talks, saying it had years to make a deal without the loss of much land, which is entirely correct, because if you recall the Istanbul agreement, there was nothing at all said either about Crimea or about Donetsk and Lugansk. They said they would be dealt with in the future. There was nothing said, you have to accept the loss of this territory. Even Crimea, there was said, well, this will be agreed upon in a future meeting between Putin and Zelensky. So even Crimea, they were not, the Istanbul Agreement was not asking for Kiev to abandon its claim on Crimea. All it was asking was disarmament from Ukraine, neutrality, neutral status, in other words, going back to its constitution, its original constitution, and incidentally to Ukraine's declaration of sovereignty in 1990, again neutrality, and basically no foreign forces stationed on Ukrainian territory. That's what the Istanbul Agreement was about. There was nothing there about Ukraine having to cede any land to Russia. So Trump is absolutely correct, without the loss of much land. And then it says, President Donald Trump has criticized Vladimir Zelensky, saying he was disappointed that the Ukrainian leader complained about being left out of talks between the US and Russia over ending the Ukraine war. Trump also seemed to blame Kiev for Moscow's invasion, even as he said he was more confident of a deal to end the war after US-Russia talks, claiming Ukraine could have made a deal to avert a war. And then it says, I'm very disappointed. I hear that they're upset about not having a seat at the talks. The US president told reporters at his Mar-a-Lago resort in Florida, when asked about the Ukrainian reaction, the US president said a, quote, a half-baked negotiator could have secured a settlement years ago without the loss of much land. Oh, correct, a half-baked negotiator. Yeah, absolutely. Half-baked negotiator. The Russians did not want this war. They did. Nobody wants a war. An agreement could easily have been achieved. And then today I heard, oh well, we weren't invited. Well, you have been there 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal, he said. And then the Ukrainian president's comments appear to anger Trump, who proceeded to launch a series of attacks on Zelensky and asked whether the US would support Russia's demands to force Zelensky to hold new elections as part of any deal. Trump said they want a seat at the table, but you could say, wouldn't the people of Ukraine have a say? It's been a long time since we've had an election, which is true. It's now almost 6 years. So that's true enough. That's not a Russian thing. That's something coming from me, from other countries. We have a situation where we haven't had elections in Ukraine, where we have essentially martial law in Ukraine with a leader in Ukraine. I mean, I hate to say it, but he's down at 4% approval rating. And where a country has been blown to smithereens, most of the cities are laying on their sides, the buildings are collapsed. It looks like a massive demolition site. And again, he's applying common sense, So, we got to keep this war going. And he's saying it's in no one's interest to keep this war going. Obviously, it's not in Ukraine's interest because of the destruction, the killing. It's not in Russia's interest for the same reason, destruction and killing. It's not in Europe's interest because it's leading to serious economic consequences, soaring energy prices, and so on. And as Trump outlines it, and we don't fully know exactly what he's thinking, it's no longer in America's interest. I mean, the Biden administration believed that it was in America's interest to defeat, degrade, destroy Russia. Trump doesn't think that is in America's interest. I mean, he obviously has some idea of wanting to use Russia for some other purpose. We can only guess at what that is, whether it's against Iran, whether it's against China, whatever. That, he no longer thinks that it's in America's interest to weaken Russia. So that's why he's saying. That's why basically he's saying we have to bring this to an end. It's in no one's interest to continue with this. But the media, they want to go on with this war. NATO wants to go on with this war, but the destruction and the dying are being done by someone else. So it's a totally irresponsible and immoral stance. And then Trump said he was much more confident of a deal after the talks, adding, they were very good. Russia wants to do something. They want to stop the savage barbarianism. I think I have the power to end this war. I think it's going very well. And I don't think he means that the war is going very well. I think he means that the talks are going very well. And then he said the US leader added that he was all for European peacekeepers in Ukraine if he can strike a deal to end the war. If they want to do it, that's great. I'm all for it. I know France was willing to do it, and I thought that was a beautiful gesture. Added Trump, saying that Britain had made a similar offer. The US would not have to contribute because, we're very far away. But of course, that clearly runs counter to what Lavrov said, that basically we will not accept British, French, or any NATO forces in Ukraine. But I think what's interesting here, and this is what really we're going to have to focus on in the coming days, weeks, and months, is that Trump, by his really very critical and hostile utterances about Ukraine, and Zelensky in particular, he now identifies the Ukrainians as the party that wants to continue with this war. So he sees Russia. Russia wants to end this war. That's the thrust of his comments. He sees Russia as the party that wants to end it. Ukraine as the party that wants to continue it. So Trump is now essentially expressing his anger and annoyance at the party that he sees as eager to continue with this war, namely the Ukrainians. And this is where it gets kind of tricky for the Russians, because if it seems as if the Russians will insist on continuing with the war, then Trump could easily change his mind and see the Russians as the party that refuses essentially his offer of peace. And then the split between the United States on the one hand and Europe on the other hand, that split will be healed. And once again, Russia will be facing a united NATO front. And I don't think Russia really wants to do that. I think Russia wants to end this. I think Russia wants to have leverage in the world. It doesn't want to become completely dependent on China or India. It wants to return, I think, to the Western markets and to begin some kind of a process of normalizing relations with the West. I mean, obviously, it's something to Russia's advantage. But if Trump sees Russia as seeking to continuing of the war, then that thing about he just said about the Ukrainians, his annoyance with them, that's going to be turned against the Russians. And then once again, united front, and then some, because I think then Trump will want to escalate, and it's just the longer any war goes on, the more uncertainties there are, and the more things could spiral out of control, and become quite dangerous. So interesting developments, quite challenging diplomacy. Russia, I think, is going to have to make a number of difficult decisions and have to maneuver very, very adroitly in the coming weeks and months. But obviously here at the Gaggle, we're going to be following this very closely and reporting on developments. So anyway, thank you very much for joining me. And remember, if you like the Gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye-bye.